That's not how business is done with these permits, especially permits that, this is no Johnny-come-lately operation. They've had these permits for generations.
Today, it's the story of Charles and Heather Maude, a young ranch family in southwestern South Dakota that have found themselves indicted for theft of federal property over 25 acres of national grasslands that have been part of this fifth-generation family since 1910. Rachel Gable, spokesman for the Maude family, is my guest as we unpack this story.
Nothing's changed. It just came out of the blue at the end of March with that no trespassing sign.
In 55 days from a meeting on May 1st with a Forest Service district ranger and a U.S. Forest Service special agent over boundary discrepancies, the Maudes find themselves now summoned to appear in U.S. District Court, separately indicted with a maximum sentence of up to 10 years in prison and fined up to $250,000. So what happened here? What are the details behind this story? Why has there been little to no information made available by the Forest Service as to why they escalated this issue quickly without trying to find resolution?
This needs to have a positive resolution, and it needs to have one quickly.
Why is this alarming to all of us in production agriculture, and is this reflective of the U.S. Forest Service or a rogue district office and an agent in South Dakota?
This is certainly not a call to arms. This was a lack of common sense that escalated extremely quickly.
It's the story of Charles and Heather Maude on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills, your host, and we thank you for joining us. We're glad to have you tune in for us along for today's show. By the way, if you missed something, you want to go back and listen to it again, it's pretty simple. You can go to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com. And you can find a link to download the show or listen to it however you want to do. Also, I encourage you to go back and listen to other shows as well. One of the things for those of you that are regular listeners, you've heard me say this before, but if this is your first time listening, a lot of shows we have on here are what we'd call evergreen, meaning that at any point in time you can listen to them and hopefully you're going to find some relevant information in it. We hope that that's the case in most of our shows here today. Today's going to be a little bit different. As you heard there in the opening, we're going to be exploring a story that's unfolding out in southwestern South Dakota. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But nevertheless, we're glad to have you joining us here on our program today. Be sure to tune in later on in the show as the Captain Tim O'Byrne, who is editor of Working Ranch Magazine, will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents. And normally we would hear from meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. However, this week he is on the road. In fact, he's down in Florida. For those of you that might follow along with him, you know that one of the things that he does kind of on the side deal is work with some folks in regards to hot air balloon travel. And I don't really know the full details of it, but I know it's something he's done for quite some time. Well, he's down in Florida doing that. We'll hope to catch up with him next week, find out maybe a little bit about that, as well as what our upcoming weather is going to look like as we look into it's hard to believe we're knocking on the door pretty close of the fall time of the year. Well, as we turn our attention towards our program today, we're going to spend the time here looking in detail at this. And I'm just going to outline from you. I'm reading from an article out of the Tri-State Livestock News, just the opening paragraph to kind of get things started here today before I introduce my guest. And it says, Charles and Heather Maude, a western South Dakota farm and ranch couple, have been indicted for theft of federal property. The summons served June 24th of 2024 charged the Maudes, beginning at a time unknown, but no later than December 20th, 2020, did knowingly steal, purloin, and convert to their own use national grasslands managed by the United States Department of Agriculture, a department and agency of the United States named approximately 25 acres of national grasslands for cultivation and approximately 25 acres of national grasslands for grazing cattle, having a value in excess of $1,000, and did aid and abet each other in violation of a statute. That kind of sets the precedence there, and I don't know for folks that's been on Facebook or social media, maybe you've seen or heard about this story. So today we're going to be looking at that story just a little bit more in detail. Joining me as our guest today is Rachel Gable, who's the assistant editor of Fence Post Magazine and a farm broadcaster for the Western Ag Network with affiliate stations through quite a bit of the Mountain States areas. And Rachel is also serving as the media spokesperson for Charles and Heather Heather Maude as well. Rachel, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks for having me, Justin. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, Rachel, this is a story that we're going to unfold and we're going to tell as we go through here our program here today. And in light of that, though, I know there's also been a lot of press for the most part that have reported on this particular incident that has happened. And I think just for the sake of putting everybody on the same page, I reached out to you as you're part of their media team to just basically let's lay out the story from the beginning through all of this and work through this. And then as we go through this, we can start to narrow in on some of the concerns that we as ranchers might have when it comes to public lands. Now, I realize there's parts of the country that don't have public lands and wouldn't necessarily understand maybe some of the situations we're dealing with here in the western half of the United States. However, I think it's an issue beyond just public lands. So Rachel, let's start from the beginning and start to lay out the story here when we talk about Charles and Heather Maude and the issue that has happened that we're hearing about here in the news.
You bet. So Charles and Heather Maude ranch in Caputa, South Dakota, which is not too far from Rapid City. And they were approached at the very end of March in 2024 and asked by Special Agent, this is U.S. Forest Service Special Agent Travis Lunders, to take down a no trespassing sign as the result of a hunter complaint. And they did that. And so that was at the end of March 29th. They met in May 1st with the district forester and Special Agent Lunders. And there was some confusion on fence lines. Now, this is a fence line that dates back sometime between 1910 and 1950. And there's never been any discussion about it previously. So it's an old fence line. There was some confusion there. There's some in-holdings that are Forest Service, maybe some in-holdings that are mods. So the bottom line was that they needed a survey, right? Mm-hmm. And because government moves at the speed of government, the forester thought that it would take probably about a year to get that done. So everyone left the meeting with the understanding that this would take this business-like, not terribly fast approach. Well, 5 days later, Special Agent Lunders showed up with a survey team, did a survey. Neither the survey nor the initial complaint from the hunter were ever released. And on May 24th, Heather and Charles were served separately indictments on federal land theft charges.
Okay. All right. So as you talk about that and you lay some of this out, I think we also need to probably look at the fact, and I want to go back to the timeline or the date that you said of there's really not a known date of when some of that Forest Service land and so much of this land, I think people need to understand, we're not just laid out exactly in 40s here as probably as most of rural America in some ways. So much of the public lands that we see is either not fenced or the fence line has been, as you had said earlier, back to maybe 1910 to 1950, the fence lines. So explain a little bit of that element, what we're dealing with the land in question here.
Sure. So the Maude family has owned some of this land since 1910, and it borders the grasslands, the national grasslands, on three sides. And the Cheyenne River is kind of the natural border. Like we said, that happens a lot. And, it could have been one of those convenience fencing issues way back in the day where, well, if you put it on the actual border, it will be flooded or, whatever will happen. So it's put a little bit off of where the actual border is. It happens a lot. But it sounds like there was a question on where the fence is, and then those in holdings, there's some Forest Service ground inside one of their hay meadows, and then sounds like some of Maude's deeded ground on the Forest Service side. So they just needed that survey. But this fence line going back to potentially 1910, in 87 days, the Special Agent Lunders took it from take down this trespassing sign to here, federal, threatening these ranchers with federal prison over this question. And the Maudes were incredibly cooperative the entire time. They're paid up, everything's in good standing. I mean, this is not a situation where the Maudes have been rebellious in any way. Everything is in good standing. And it was really escalated in a non-business-like way that we would not come to expect from the Forest Service.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know in one of the comments discussion that you and I had a few days before our conversation here today, and so many of us are in the same boat that are ranchers, and it doesn't matter where you're at in anywhere, ranchers, farmers, anywhere in the country. And that is, if you do any work or dealings with the FSA, you have to certify acres every year, correct? And that's something that they had done for years at the USDA office with the FSA, correct?
Correct. And of course, the Forest Service and the National Grasslands are managed by, essentially the USDA. And there was not question brought up about that. There was a pivot put on the ground 4 years ago. So it's not like there's anything new. Nothing's changed. The management of the land hasn't changed. They have had the allotment, the permit on that national grasslands for generations. Mm-hmm. Nothing's changed. It just came out of the blue at the end of March with that no trespassing sign.
Now, Rachel, it sounds to me like in some of the material that I've read and trying to research some of this story, there's some element of this maybe going back to, again, there's a lot of unknowns in this, which is kind of the concern we all as ranchers have. And I think you're throwing that same question out there to our listeners as well. But there's some date you'd mentioned about a pivot being put in. Explain some of that element that's part of this discussion in this story.
Well, as far as the pivot, the base of it sits on Maude's deeded land. And I don't know if it sprays over onto the Forest Service land, because I'm not clear on where the boundaries are either, because we need that survey. But it's difficult to kind of wrap your brain around it because the indictment is sealed and all of these things have never been received. So we're kind of moving blindly toward potentially appearing in front of this Congressional Oversight Committee. And it's difficult to know what's going on, because that's the communication that you would expect with the Forest Service of, here's the complaint, we'd like you to do this. Here is our response. Here is our request. This is what's being done. None of that occurred. So having those unknowns is extremely troubling, because that's not how business is done with these permits, especially permits that, this is no Johnny come lately operation. They've had these permits for generations.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, let's take a break here. When we come back, we still have more to unfold in this story. I know there's been a lot of response, or quite a bit of response from public officials, even back into D.C., which I know you have been more on the ground level with that. I want to talk about some of those kinds of things. And as we continue through this conversation, folks, I think the point that we're getting here is telling this story out there, not to try to criminalize or come after any particular one entity, other than the questions that Rachel was raising here about how things progressed in really a non-business ethical fashion, and some of the concerns we would have there. And I think is alarming to each of us as ranchers, whether we have public land or not, other than in the fact that you're dealing with a public agency of some sort. So we're going to visit more about those kinds of questions, those kinds of subjects when we return here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we head to break, it's a good time to go refill your coffee cup. It's what I'm going to do. I've got a fresh pot of Cowpuncher coffee all ready to go. It's what we drink here at the Working Ranch Radio Show studios and at the X-Ring Ranch. It's the essence of craft coffee that lies in the bean and the skill of the master roaster. And you'll find that with Cowpuncher coffee. You can give Jim or Trish Williams a call. Check them out online at cowpunchercoffee.com. They've got all different flavors and types of coffee, even the K-Cups. In fact, they sent me a box of K-Cups. I'm going to be trying those out here in the coming few days as well. Grab a mug and let's spur the day with Cowpuncher Coffee.
This year, choose to unlock the full potential of your cattle operation with K-Line Irrigation, the affordable and dynamic solution for grass-based livestock operations. Beat drought by planning ahead with the most user-friendly irrigation system. K-Line systems ensure optimal water distribution across all acres and are unencumbered by obstacles such as fence lines or steep terrain. Don't miss out on untapped pasture potential. Choose K-Line to secure the future of your grazing operation. For more information, visit our website at www.k-linena.com. Be sure to fill out a consultation form so our designers can create an estimate for your project. K-Line Irrigation, for greener, more productive pastures anywhere.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. You know, as you flip through social media, you do see a lot of ranch land for sale. And for those in the market wanting to buy, that's a good thing to be able to see that, see what's out there. But what about if you're a ranch family that's on the selling side of that transaction? You know what I wonder is when I see that, did they want to sell? Did they have any other options laid out for them that might have allowed them to retain the land if they wanted to do that? Yeah, it's kind of complicated when you look at the circumstances for each outfit. But what I would suggest is that before you do anything, if you're looking to sell, wouldn't you just like to explore some options? Maybe just sit down with someone at the kitchen table. You know, about 78 years ago, Henry Hall and his son Warren founded Hall Mortgage Company, and they built a relationship with hard-working ranchers, just like a lot of us across the country, by providing solid and trusting advice guided by a principle of integrity. Now, today we know them as Hall & Hall, and nothing's changed with how they work with folks like you and I. Yeah, they're real estate brokers throughout the United States and Canada. For buyers, they can provide long-term financing as well. But for either side of the transaction you might be on, they also offer services far and above beyond what regular brokerage firms offer. And really at the heart of it is this. They want to see land stay in production agriculture, which is why they can help with things like ranch management personnel, assisting with management of the day-to-day operations, and even drafting leases. Since 1946, Hall & Hall has been dedicated to the land and landowners. And if you're at a point where you're ready to sit down and talk about the future of your land asset, or maybe just brainstorm some options, I'd encourage you to reach out to the folks at Hall & Hall. Head to their website at hallandhall.com for more information. Well, as we turn our attention to our subject at hand here today, my guest today is Rachel Gable. She is the spokesperson for Charles and Heather Maude, and we are telling that story here today. If you're just joining us, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it. Maybe you've heard a little bit about it, seen some information about it on social media, but it is in regards to Charles and Heather Maude and an indictment coming against them in regards to some land issues regarding Forest Service land and deeded land. And we told most of kind of how that came in the last segment. And I think really for a lot of us in ranching or farming, it really doesn't matter. There's just, it kind of raises a little hair on the back of your neck, or just some concern as far as how this is progressing. How did it get this far? How did it escalate so quickly in what we're dealing with here today? Rachel, I want to talk about, we talked a little bit about Charles and Heather Maude as far as who this is in reflection of, but let's talk a little bit more about the family, because it's been there. They're out of Caputa, South Dakota, which is, if you're kind of familiar with where Rapid City, South Dakota is, it'd probably be a little bit south and east of there. And so let's talk about the Maude family and kind of where that came from, because I know even in my own thought, when the first time this story came through, Rachel, I'm like, well, we need to kind of hear about the family. We need to know about the family. Where is this legit, or is this just somebody that didn't do what they were supposed to do? And it was interesting because we find out that, you know, it's pretty legit here in what they are. And I want you to explain a little bit more about their family.
So the operation, this portion of it was purchased in 1910. And of course, Charles is the fifth generation on that operation. And he actually purchased it when he was 17, which I think is really impressive. You know, he's got a long history in agriculture. He was gifted his first cow before he was even born, and and then bought the operation when he was 17. He still went on to get his degree from South Dakota State University in 2007. And, you know, not to be a slacker, but boy, he had an animal science degree with ag marketing, range and pasture management, and agronomy. So he's a well-rounded guy. Heather is originally from Niobrara County, Wyoming, and she went to the University of Wyoming. She was the editor of a magazine up in that country for quite a while, and she's also fifth generation on that operation. They used to, when they were first dating, Charles used to joke about how she lived 50 miles from town. Most of it was gravel, and then she was 16 cattle guards off the highway.
Yeah.
So, she's a good Wyoming girl. But they've got two little kids, and they're raising them on the family operation, and they have a pasture to table meat business that they've really grown with beef and pork. So they're very diversified, and they've been doing what they are supposed to be doing. They're involved in their community. They're involved in Farm Bureau and the fire departments. And, they're just good, solid people.
Mm-hmm. So as this has begun to unfold, it's definitely caught the ear of several different entities, organizations that represent ranchers on really across the board, in addition to some public officials. So I know that's been something that you've had a little bit more hands-on approach in dealing with this. Tell me what you're finding or what you're hearing or the response that you're seeing as it's made its way into D.C. or other state and public officials.
Sure. Yep. Senator Rounds from South Dakota really fired the first shot with a letter to Secretary Vilsack asking him to look into this. And I've not heard Vilsack's response. I'm unaware of one, but Rounds was kind of the first one to sound the alarm, and a number of producers sounded the alarm with National Cattlemen's Beef Association as well as Public Lands Council there in D.C. And what surprised me about my conversation, especially with Ethan Lane, who is the Vice President for Government Affairs at NCBA, he said that he certainly met the news with a lot of anger. And the folks that he took the news to, it was met with the same degree of anger. But no one was particularly surprised. And I think that's particularly troubling, that there's such a history of bad behavior in that area by some of those agencies, and a history of poor relationships. Now, that's not to say this is agency-wide. I think it's important to recognize that it's likely not. It's likely a handful of law enforcement that's behaving out of bounds. And, it shakes the faith of all of the permittees, and it's a black eye on the guys who are doing a good job, who are parts of their community. And I think that they should be as mad as we are. Mm-hmm. I mean, behavior like this makes you trust your agency representative one day and then look sideways at them the next. And we certainly don't want to do that. We want to look at this as a singular incident, and hopefully that it's one that's entirely solvable, which I think it is. But, we need to continue to work with those agencies because they're an important part of ranching. They're an important part of the community. They're an important part of a lot of guys' bottom line. And trust but verify, and continue to make sure that your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted, and that your permits are up to date, and that they're paid up and everything's on the up and up, and keep good records.
Rachel, in regards to the work that you've kind of been watching and working with in regards to some of the correspondence back in Washington, D.C., you said Senator Rounds, of course, of South Dakota, has had a response to this. I know a couple different of the organizations as well. What are they leading you to believe as far as the next step? I mean, what are they wanting as far as a resolution? What are they wanting to see? What are they pushing for?
Sure. Well, we're pushing and we're waiting for the Natural Resources Committee to take a look at this. And Ethan Lane was very clear that the chairman and members of the Natural Resources Committee are acutely aware of this long history of this sort of behavior in this part of the world, and aware of some of the players and some of the challenges. So we're looking toward that committee seeing some of these Forest Service, all the way down to Special Agent Lunders and all of the people in the offices who helped make this happen, allowed this to happen, didn't slow it down, didn't do anything to resolve it. I think there's plenty of accountability to go around. And I think that starts with that Natural Resources Committee. Of course, what we'd like to have happen is those charges dropped immediately, not negotiated down, but dropped. And that this is allowed to take a normal course of business to resolve this with a landowner and with permittees that are absolutely willing to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rachel, let's take another break here. And when we come back, I want to explore a little bit deeper into the charges that were brought against both Charles and Heather, the scope of all of that, what that all entails. We're going to look at that when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. This segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics. To find out more, go to their website at gelbvieh.org.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer-influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer-influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and had excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer genetics.
And welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest today is Rachel Gable. As we have been talking and unfolding the story here, maybe you've heard about it, maybe you haven't, in regards to Charles and Heather Maude out of western South Dakota, a couple that had been indicted for theft of federal property. We've outlined and talked a little bit about that story. If you're just joining us, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to the first segment, and you can hear, as Rachel described, kind of a little bit about what's happening. We're going to talk about some of those specific charges here in just a little bit, but Rachel, in the last segment, we were talking about some of the response that you had seen as the story began to unfold and get out there in regards to back into Washington, D.C., even to some of the public officials. I know Senator Mike Rounds has definitely jumped on this quite aggressively. Explain a little bit about what his concern was in the letter that he voiced out there.
Sure. His main complaint and his main concern, of course, was that this moved so quickly and that the survey's not been given and there's been no warning prior to being served a summons to appear in U.S. District Court. And this was all while they were working cooperatively to resolve the issue with the Forest Service. So, this is a family that has had permit agreements with the Forest Service for 60 years, and that the Forest Service, through the USDA's FSA, has repeatedly acknowledged those boundaries and those acreages through all of the certifications of those acres for years and years. And he mentions also that the criminal indictment appears unnecessary and that it conflicts with USDA's stated good neighbor practices with regard to the partnerships with permittees and landowners. And it talks a little bit about how it specifically works against the Small Tracts Act of 2020, which would provide greater flexibility in cases like this, where they would be able to work together to sustain the land and all of the things that happened to the Maudes. Senator Rounds' point was that all of those things are inconsistent with what the Forest Service says that their goal to be a good neighbor. Mm-hmm. It's all inconsistent with that. And of course, there's such a lack of information. Senator Rounds asked for all of the correspondence between the USDA Forest Service and the Maudes, and all of the correspondence between the Forest Service and the Department of Justice, because we just don't have it. We just don't know what all of that was. So we're really going into being threatened with federal prison over evidence that we're not even sure what it is.
Yeah. You had talked about that Senator Rounds had sent a letter to USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack, and you've yet to hear any response on that. And I want to give him the benefit of the doubt by all means, because I know there's a lot of things that he deals with. But is there a little concern that at this point in time, I don't know, what was the date that Senator Rounds sent that letter to USDA Secretary Vilsack? You know, off the top of your head?
July 7th.
July 7th. So we're over a month out. Any concern that we've not heard any response from the USDA's Secretary of Agriculture?
Well, it really speaks to the speed of government and the speed at which the USDA typically moves. And we're seeing that from the Secretary, but we certainly didn't see it from the Forest Service. So it could be that he's waiting to see what the Natural Resources Committee has to say. And I can't put words in his mouth, but it is frustrating that we've not heard anything back.
You had mentioned, I think, in the previous segment about the committee meeting. What's the timeline there? Do you know when they're planning to meet? Maybe you already mentioned that, and I didn't write it down here in front of me. But what's the timeline on that?
I'm not sure, but I would expect it in the next 30 days.
Okay.
I would think. Like I said, it's really frustrating because government moves slow, and unfortunately, moving from a no trespassing sign to federal indictments in 87 days is not reflective of the typical speed of government, but we're certainly seeing that as we're asking for the government to move on this.
Yeah.
So that's been frustrating.
One of the things you mentioned was about the Small Tracts Act that was updated in 2020. And coincidentally, as I'm here in northeastern Wyoming and Weston County, Wyoming, a neighbor to my south who is chairman of the Association of National Grasslands and a gentleman I know fairly well, Ty Checketts out of Newcastle, Wyoming, is chairman of the National Grasslands Association and has some real concern, mainly because it feels like hopefully this is not reflective on the Forest Service as a whole. And I think that was something you and I talked a little bit about a bit ago. But the reality was that Small Tracts Act that was updated should have made some accommodations for this, correct?
Absolutely. That allows the Forest Service to trade or sell tracts less than 40 acres under certain circumstances. The original correspondence was that it was like 10 or 20 acres. So it certainly would have fit under there. Of course, Checketts is the Association of National Grasslands president. And he said that when he spoke to Carrie Stadheim, who's the editor of the Tri-State Livestock News, he said, the Small Tracts Act should have certainly been a possible resolution. And he did say that this is uncharacteristic of the Forest Service and it's strange and it's scary, but it could have been handled in a much more peaceful and resolution-driven manner, and that the mods were willing to work it out. And the Forest Service had the Small Tracts Act in their back pocket, and so it should have been fairly easy to resolve. That Small Tracts Act amends the authority to sell or exchange or interchange small parcels of land that are 40 acres or less. So if there were mod private deeded land on the Forest Service side and Forest Service land on the mod side, well, there could have certainly been a swap. Now, that's not something that's going to happen overnight, but that's a tool in the toolbox that is allowed, and it's right. And it's good to have that ability to make those decisions on the fly for the boots on the ground guys.
Well, and I think that was put into place in some ways so that it doesn't have to go to a committee. Right. Which is what we're waiting on, in a way, for any resolution to happen. And it sounds like now we're headed to a point where it's going to have to be in front of a congressional committee to maybe see some resolution in some of this, which is in a way kind of unfortunate. Let's talk about the indictment, because I think that in itself is also another a little bit of an alarming thing. And I guess in all of this, it's as you start to do 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, things start to add up. And that's probably where, for just those of us listening, that has some alarm. We keep saying that over and over. Let's talk about the indictment, because they were both indicted independently, which brings a whole other element to this entire deal. So explain that, Rachel.
Sure. So because they were indicted separately, it's because the Forest Service is claiming that they aided and abetted each other in the theft of this federal land. So because they were indicted separately, they both have to maintain separate counsel. So 2 different attorneys, 2 different sets of hours and paperwork and everything separate. So it essentially doubles the cost on something that's already not only unnecessary, but certainly very expensive. So they were indicted on the theft of federal property. And of course, the indictment's sealed, so we don't know exactly what's in it. But on the summons, it said that sometime beginning at a time unknown, but no later than 2020. Okay. So in that timeline, they did knowingly steal, purloin, and convert to their own use national grasslands managed by the USDA. And they say it was about 25 acres, having a value in excess of $1,000, and that they aided and abetted one another. So essentially, legally, they're not even to speak about this to one another because they were indicted separately.
Has there been any assistance to them from legal minds, lawyers, attorneys, or firms that have been willing to reach out or help them at all?
I think there's been some help and some guidance, but they've both had to retain their own attorneys. And so they're facing, up to 10 years in prison each and fines up to $250,000 each.
Mm-hmm. And I know it's probably something I should have mentioned when I first introduced you in the first segment. It was part of the reason that you're here and you and I are having this discussion is because they've been advised, of course, is to not have any media discussion at all. And so you've kind of been that mediator for them on that. And I think that's something probably should have spelled out when we first started talking here today, why we're not talking with them directly. In regards to this indictment and the complication of them both being indicted separately. Is there anything else from a standpoint of complications in that element that you can think of that just makes this even more complicated?
Well, I think some of the things that have come to light since then have been also complicated. This special agent, Travis Lenders, also approached one of their neighbors, and his name is Frank Bloom. He's a neighboring rancher. He shares a fence line with the Maudes. And he said that same agent just completed what he thought was a 4-day survey near his house. They were on his private deeded land without permission, and they were out there for 4 days, but never communicated to him what they were doing. Mm-hmm. So, of course, it seems fairly simple that the Forest Service could have come to this landowner and said, hey, we're going to survey this, FYI. But Lenders didn't tell Bloom why they were surveying the property, didn't give him anything. And he said that he has 11 acres of national grasslands is on his side and 40 acres of his is on their side. So this seems to not be just a Maude issue. It seems like this is probably a convenience fence that was put in with some just common sense in mind back in the day because it's right there on the river breaks. So he's kind of waiting to see what happens with him. Mm-hmm. And we certainly don't want to see another federal indictment over 11 acres on this situation either. So it's that concerns me greatly.
Yeah, that's for sure. All right, Rachel, let's take one more break here. And when we come back, I just want to wrap up our conversation and at the same time, kind of how should we think through this? I think we've been very cautious as we've talked through this as far as where the concern is at. But as we kind of come to some resolution, what can we do? What should we be doing? What are we hoping to see happen in that? And that'll how we can wrap up our conversation here today. We'll be back on the Working Ranch Radio Show after this. Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest today is Rachel Gable, who is the assistant editor of the Fence Post magazine, also a farm broadcaster for the Western Ag Network and the media spokesperson for Charles and Heather Maude, who we have been unveiling their story a little bit today, the concern in regards to maybe a little bit of overreach that has been seen in that and the concern that many of us in the ranching or farming industry would have, regardless of the fact, Rachel, I keep saying this, regardless of the fact of whether it's not necessarily just a land issue. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, there's some concern because we're dealing with federal agencies, and I think that's a little bit alarming for some of the folks. Would you agree than the ones that you have talked to?
Absolutely. I think that's alarming, especially in the shadow of like the BLM proposed rules mm-hmm. that were not positive for a lot of not just ranchers and grazers, but also other multiple users from recreation to mineral extraction. There's been a lot of those things, and it feels very much like agriculture's been under attack, and you don't want to feel that way. But when you have these sorts of headlines, it's hard to not feel that way.
Yeah. Well, and I think it echoes, I think the other side, we echo what I had talked a little bit a bit ago about, Ty Checketts, who is with the Association of National Grasslands. And there's a lot of folks that have good relationships with their BLM offices and their Forest Service offices. And there's been a lot of work over the years to make that happen. And we hate to see that just erode because of a situation happening here in southwestern South Dakota. That's the concern as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. The positive to come out of it is that there's been ranchers of all stripes that have come together to support the Maudes and to support bringing this to resolution. You know, it's not every day that NCBA, USCA, and RCAF, and we're all on the toe in the line and making sure that we're getting to a good resolution. And I think that speaks to not only the quality of the people behind those associations, certainly doesn't matter what bumper stickers on their flatbed, they're quality individuals. And it speaks to the situation itself, that this was confusing and that everyone's willing to put aside their differences. And that if, a family like the Maudes can be targeted and prosecuted in South Dakota, then this can happen anywhere. That overreach can happen anywhere. And that's disconcerting.
Yeah. As you had talked about some of the organizations that haven't always been eye to eye on a lot of issues, I look at some of the industry support as I read some of this stuff. And as you'd already talked about, RCAF USA, NCBA, also U.S. Cattlemen's Association, the Public Lands Council, the Association of National Grasslands, South Dakota Farm Bureau, South Dakota Stock Growers, South Dakota Cattlemen, South Dakota Farmers Union, South Dakota Public Lands Council, Wyoming Farm Bureau. I mean, as you said, if there's a positive in that, it's seeing some of these organizations, some of these folks coming together.
Oh, yeah. And there's certainly all kinds of opportunity for those groups to come together, and they're maybe not as able to, but this is definitely one where you've seen them come together all the way down to the local fire departments.
Yeah.
We've had letters from all of them. And there's some concern about the thing that we hear over and over and over is just the lack of common sense. And that was something that the RCAF letter, Shad Sullivan, I believe, was behind that. And maybe Brett Kinsey were both on. And they said, there was just a lack of common sense regarding the fact that this primitive survey boundaries are often imperfect. And it's right on the Cheyenne River breaks. There could be a very good reason for where it was put where it's put. And of course, we see that a lot. Mm-hmm. And we completely missed the boat on a common sense solution. And so despite what the Forest Service, what Lunder's purpose was, it certainly looks like overreach and abuse of power.
So, Rachel, as we have the last few minutes of our conversation here today, I want to talk about where our minds need to be at in this. I think the concern is that we don't become a lynch mob and just go after an entity, or in this case, the Forest Service, or whatever the case may be, that we really kind of step back from about 20,000 feet, look at the situation, and be civilized in our response. What does civilized response look like to you?
Civilized response looks like reaching out to your representatives and reaching out to your Forest Service representatives to make sure that all of your permits are in line, and reaching out to your trade organizations that you belong to and communicating to them that's what you think about this and what you want them to move forward with. This needs to have a positive resolution, and it needs to have one quickly. Mm-hmm. So we need to just hold each other to a better standard. This is certainly not a call to arms. This is not a Bundy standoff situation. Yeah. This was a lack of common sense that escalated extremely quickly. And we've got to come together through our trade organizations and through our representatives, because, the government works for us, mm-hmm. not the other way around.
Yeah. So as we had talked about in the last segment, their indictment being separately, that they both have to retain attorneys, we're talking a lot of expense here. And I just throw this question out there because people need to look at in their own minds and reflect on our conversation here today. But if folks were wanting to help them out, what's ways that could be done? Because I know that's been maybe a bit slow in response for folks. And I think some of it's wanting to know, well, what's the full story, which is what I hope we were able to talk about here today. Here's the full story of what's going on. Yet at the same time, this is not going to be easy for a young ranching family. How do we support them?
Well, you can support them through pushing your trade organizations and your elected officials to action, of course, but there's also a GoFundMe that is available, and we can certainly put that in the show notes, or mm-hmm. It's on Tri-State Livestock News, it's on the Fence Post magazine, and it's also on Western Ag Network, so it's certainly fairly easy to find there. But this is going to be an incredibly costly thing, because they've doubled their expenses. And of course, fighting the government is never cheap.
Yeah. I don't know that we talked a little timeline on some of the other things that have happened. Do we have a timeline on when things are going to start to happen for them? We're talking being in court. I know they're already having to meet with an attorney now, so that's happening. But what's the next step that's going to happen?
Well, it sounds like the attorneys are going to see what's in the indictment, or have seen what's in the indictment, so they kind of know what they're working with, moving toward the next court date, and I don't have in front of me what that court date is. And I'm not sure that it's even public record and then it's been put out there. But hopefully the committee will move to action here in the next 30 to 45, 60 days. And that, because those folks are the ones with the oversight powers there in Washington, D.C., and I think because this has received so much media and because it's been met with so much anger from the top down, and that there's plenty of accountability to dole out, plenty to go around, hopefully that committee will move to action and hopefully circumvent some of those court actions and get it resolved.
Yeah. Rachel, just a final comment here. And one of the things that you kept saying, and it was also reflective in a lot of the different folks' response, is a common sense approach to getting this figured out. And I think the concern here is the fact that as we wrap up here today, the concern would be is at what point was the failure in the system that allowed it to get to this point? There's been a breakdown that's allowed this to escalate. And I think really that's part of this resolution that is being sought, is finding that weak link and getting that resolved. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. When you're looking at something that happened sometime between 1910 and 2020, but came to fruition with threatening a couple with federal prison in 87 days, there's clearly a breakdown there somewhere. But we've got to figure out where that breakdown was sometime between 1910 and 2020.
You bet. Well, Rachel, just some final comments from you. I appreciate you coming on. I know as you've been the media spokesperson for the mods, and you yourself, an ag reporter yourself, delving into this as well and looking at it from a media perspective, just some final comments from you regarding this.
Well, I think it's important that we maintain those good relationships that we have in our communities, and we maintain that the Forest Service does want to work in partnership with ranching, because ranching and grazing and permitting and hunting and mineral extraction and recreation and everything is very important on those Forest Service lands, on those BLM lands, any of those multi-use lands. And I think that we enjoy a beneficial relationship there, and that with a bit of common sense and a bit of double checking to make sure that everything is on the up and up certainly benefits everyone. This isn't a call to arms. This is just a call to get your attention and to show that this can happen in the worst case scenario, of course, but we need to be aware and make sure that we're holding up our end of the bargain.
You bet. Well, Rachel, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Now, if you'd like to continue to follow along with what is transpiring in this story for Charles and Heather Maude, a couple places you can do that. If you just probably go to social media or you search online the websites for either the Fence Post magazine or, of course, the Tri-State Livestock News, which is kind of the mothership of that media source there. Tri-State Livestock News is out of South Dakota following this story and has been quite extensively. Rachel is affiliated with both of those publications. You can follow along there. And then also, if you're interested in helping the mods with some of the financial support or legal support that they might need in regards to a lot of this that's going to take place. It's already taking place. We will leave a link in the show notes where you can go to the GoFundMe page or any information there should you desire to help them out in that case. But in regards to our story here today, again, to reemphasize what Rachel said a couple times, it's not a call to arms. It's a call to being attentive, a call to action, to reach out to your fellow senators, your respective senators or congressmen and women. Let them know what's going on, your industry organizations, to let them know what's going on so that we can be united as an industry together in support of this young family. And should you want to give financially or legally, however you want to do to help them in their legal support that they're going to need, please feel free to do as you feel called to do. Again, we will have links to that information in our show notes here today. Stay with us. When we come back, the Captain Tim O'Byrne will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. I know you're hard at it. Fall's coming. I can feel it in the air, even down here in the blistering hot southwest United States. I don't have a whole lot of time today, Justin, because we're putting the finishing touches on our September-October issue of Working Ranch magazine. So many great photographs in this issue, so many great stories. One thing kind of jumped out at me. It was our illustrious publisher, Drew Lawler, was walking through the concourse at John Wayne Airport in California and saw one of those backlit big advertisement signs, and it was from the California Cattle Council. And it just was a great message. It said that we are sustainable beef producers and we take care of California's rangelands and forestry. And it's just a great message to have out there to the urban folks that are going through airports like that. Great job, California Cattle Council. And boy, I tell you what, my phone's ringing off the hook here, Justin. I better get back at it. So back to you in the booth.
All right. Thanks, Captain. Appreciate the work there. Looking forward to that next issue of Working Ranch Magazine coming out. And folks, just a reminder, if you do not have a subscription to Working Ranch Magazine, it's actually quite simple. If you go to the website at workingranchmag.com, you can start your subscription there. Or by chance, of course, you can do it the old-fashioned way. Nothing against it, but it's kind of how we used to do it on magazines. If you have a copy of one, there's usually a little card in there that you can start your subscription as well with that. And I can tell you, this is one of the most informative magazines there is out there for those of us in ranching, and I think you'll enjoy and learn a lot from the articles that they have in each and every issue. So again, if you don't have a subscription, it's pretty easy to get started. Go to the website at workingranchmag.com. We'll take a break. When we come back, I'll tell you what we're going to be working on for next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelb and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelb and Balancer influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelb and Balancer genetics.
A lot of debate in our industry regarding mandatory animal identification, and next week we're going to hear both sides of that issue, as we'll hear from NCBA and why their support of that. In addition, we'll also hear from the other side, the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, and why they're in support of Representative Harriet Hagerman out of Wyoming's joint resolution to block APHIS's rule mandating electronic ID ear tags for bison and cattle moving interstate. It's a big topic. You want to tune in on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Before we head out here today, thank you to our sponsors of the Working Ranch Radio Show, the American Gelb Association, Hall & Hall, Purina, Equine Supplements, Cowpuncher Coffee, and Tank Toad. It's what we use here on our ranching operation to monitor our water cistern tanks. Give Meadowlark Solutions a call today for tank monitors, well controllers, generators, and more at 801-252-6135 or online at tanktoad.com. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. And like I said in the last segment, if you want to get started on this next issue coming out and you don't have a subscription, it's pretty easy to get started by going to workingranchmag.com. If you'd like to get a hold of me, my email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us. Tune in next week at the same time, same place, or on your favorite podcast provider. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.